Hi, I'm Kristen, and this is my presentation, The Role of Silence in Real-Life Situations of Intimate Partner Violence, that I did at the International Forum for Psychoanalytic Education back in the fall of 2018. Today, I would like to engage you in an exploration of the interplay between intimate partner violence and silence from the conceptual framework of Freud's 1914 essay, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through. In case you're more familiar with the term domestic violence, intimate partner violence is used to refer to this physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, including threats of violence, by a current or past relational partner. Throughout this presentation, I invite you to contemplate the following two questions for clinical practice with individuals affected by intimate partner violence. 1. How might silence manifest as a form of resistance? And 2, how might the process of remembering facilitate recovery? I would like to begin with an experience shared by a woman in recovery from an abusive relationship. She described a situation in which her abusive boyfriend's family overheard him harming her. She described how he was hurting her inside of a closed bedroom and how he was screaming at her like he hated her. And she said, I just don't remember these things. And his family member would knock on the door as if to tell us, hey, you gotta stop. And we wouldn't say anything. Like it was so private, even though everybody knew. But nothing ever happened. Aside from knocking on the door, his relatives did not intervene or ask about what had happened, and the abuse continued within their relationship. During this presentation, I will draw from the material that was previously published in my doctoral dissertation research entitled Woman and Predator, Intimate Partner Violence at Home and in Bluebeard. To provide a little background on the context in which this material was gathered, I'll briefly explain my research. I interviewed 4 adult women between the ages of 27 to 60 who had previously been in abusive relationships and had not been in an abusive relationship for at least 2 years. These interviews focused on systemic factors, the progression of the abuse, the development of insight, and the process of separation. After completing the interviews, each woman independently read Bluebeard, and then they answered a reflection questionnaire designed to elicit their interpretation of the fairy tale. I will quote directly from some of their responses throughout this presentation. Bluebeard is a fairy tale that was first published in 1697. It's about a naive young woman who marries a wealthy man with a suspicious history. He's been married several times, and nobody knows what has become of his previous wives. This translation that I refer to is by Perrault. After the wedding, he presents his wife with the keys to his castle and tells her that she can explore all of the rooms and all of his treasures, but he forbids her to enter one specific room. Once he's gone, she has to decide whether to yield to her curiosity and risk his rage by opening that door, or stay in her role as a compliant, naive new bride. She eventually opens the door and discovers that the room contains the dismembered bodies of his previous wives. In horror, she drops the keys onto the room's bloody floor. After closing and locking the door, she begins to wash the key to try to hide the signs of her transgression, but it will not come clean. And once Bluebeard returns, he sees the keys, even though she tries to hide them from him at first, and realizes what she has done. He is about to kill her, but her brothers arrive just in time and kill him. She survives, and the reader is left to wonder about entrapment, curiosity, agency, boundaries, and intrusion. I wanted to introduce the background to Bluebeard's Forbidden Room, since it inspired my research. There seems to be a symbolic parallel between Bluebeard's Forbidden Room and the private spaces in which intimate partner violence occurs. Like Bluebeard, the women described perceiving their abusive ex-boyfriends as more experienced and socially powerful. These men were older, physically attractive, streetwise, and popular. They were also risky. They were rumored to have problems with ex-girlfriends, use or sell drugs, have difficulty staying in school or keeping jobs. Instead of blaming their ex-boyfriends for their dishonesty or predatory behavior, these women typically focused on their own naivete or how they overlooked red flags. For example, one woman compared herself to Bluebeard's wife and how she knew his previous wives had disappeared, but was, quote, won over by charm and the promise of a good life. She completely ignored the fact that she could maybe disappear too. I can identify with this because I did the exact same thing in my relationship. The powerful and charismatic bad boy character usually seems to present with a combination of deception and seduction. Much like a gothic romance, one has to wonder what is so attractive about a man cloaked in mystery, and why a woman might be drawn into a relationship where sinister repetition is possible. Forgetting and deception may play important roles in the development of a romantic relationship characterized by intimate partner violence. The way the women described ignoring red flags gave me the impression that there was some unconscious dimension to this process. I was left wondering if what happened on an intrapsychic level was a form of dissociative denial that resulted in forgetting or turning away from what they were intuitively aware of. Intuition, which can be described as an innate capacity for perception, allows us to somehow know about, quote, the violence we steered clear of, or too often the violence we elected not to steer clear of. That is from De Becker, 2010. It is interesting to consider if there may be a relationship between silencing one's intuition and being vulnerable to violence. I'd like to return to the scene described in the beginning in order to explore the dialectic between communication and silencing. So in this image, we have a young woman and her boyfriend in an enclosed private space, a bedroom, and the family's socializing nearby. He's actively harming her, and someone hears the noise, comes to the door, and instead of opening the door, just simply knocks. The knock is abrupt and silencing. It's a cue to stop, but there's no subsequent follow-through. We don't even know if the knock stopped the violence in the moment or if it just caused him to quiet down. What kept that family member from opening the door or from asking afterwards what was going on? It's interesting that the knock satisfies his or her need to intervene. Afterward, the woman shared that nobody, herself and her ex-boyfriend included, said anything, and that everyone acted as if nothing had happened. This scene seems to speak to the role of silence and psychic avoidance or forgetting in the perpetuation of intimate partner violence. While it is possible that the boyfriend's family may have been complicit or negligent in not taking more action to address the abuse, I wonder if their ability to process what was happening affected their ability to intervene. Research by medical professionals like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk has shown that when individuals recall a traumatic event, neural activity in the Broca's area, which is the language center of the brain, is markedly decreased. The experience of trauma could literally be silencing. When individuals are in a state of hyperarousal due to trauma, they can have difficulty concentrating, processing, and integrating information. This can lead to unknowing repetition. If trauma has not been worked through, dynamics like intrusion, aggression, and mistrust may continue to play out in interpersonal relationships and in the transference relationship. Activities that calm the nervous system, like deep breathing, grounding, and progressive muscle relaxation, may help the patient and the therapist manage their physiological stress and prevent dissociation while working with trauma. In Freud's 1914 essay, he describes two distinct types of forgetting. One that pertains to the experiences of the external world, and one that relates to primarily internal psychical processes. He explains that forgetting scenes or experiences, quote, nearly always reduces itself to shutting them off, but that forgetting internal acts is different because it particularly often happens that something is remembered which could never have been forgotten, because it was never at any time noticed, was never conscious. Freud's conceptualization of forgetting seems to apply to the phenomena of naivete, partial knowledge, or dissociative denial. When we forget instead of remember, we may become distanced from our insight and intuition. The dynamic of forgetting may occur within the person being abused as well as within their larger family and immediate community. In fact, I have questioned throughout my research how, these dynamics like safety and the concern of The repetition and the separation return cycle complicate therapeutic work. A woman may make on average 3 to 6 attempts to leave before finally achieving separation from an abusive partner. That's from Sheffer, Lindgren, and Rank, 2008. Therapists working with individuals caught in the separation return cycle could experience intense countertransference reactions like fear, frustration, dread, and the urge to rescue. Intrusion, aggression, mistrust, and other dynamics associated with unresolved trauma can play out in the transference relationship between the therapist and the client. Individuals with unresolved trauma may enter into the clinical relationship as, quote, not another person who is a partner in this enterprise, but as a person who is either totally submitted to the physician or the psychiatrist, or who needs to protect himself against potential victimization. That's from Korn, 2001. The ability to work through challenging countertransference may also be complicated by frequent exposure to disturbing content in session. Compassion fatigue is secondary or vicarious trauma that compromises clinicians in their ability to care for patients because the symptoms parallel post-traumatic stress disorder. That's from Gallagher, 2013. In layman's terms, a therapist may feel depressed, stressed, on edge, numb, detached, unsafe, separated from his or her body, or out of touch with reality as a consequence of doing trauma work without enough countermeasures. I'd like to return again to the image of knocking on a door because I think it speaks to the transference relationship. Imagine that the patient is inside the room, alone with the problem that is bringing them to therapy. The problem wants to stay concealed. Right outside the door stands the therapist. The therapist might knock, intervening just enough to satisfy his or her professional obligation, while still keeping the problem at a distance. The therapist knows the patient is there, but doesn't take the risk of saying what needs to be said, or of really joining the patient in the experience. Following the therapist's lead, the patient may stay silent. If left unaddressed, this silence could result in premature termination of treatment. Freud discusses how the process of analysis and working through resistance are key for breaking the pattern of acting out. He explains how, quote, the patient does not remember anything of what he has forgotten and repressed, but acts it out. He reproduces it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats it without, of course, knowing that he is repeating it. This compulsive repetition, quote, which now replaces the impulsion to remember, not only in his personal attitude towards his doctor, the transference relationship, but also in every other activity and relationship which may occupy his life at the time, and that this can be understood as the patient's way of remembering. He cautions that the more severe a patient's resistance is to treatment, the more intensely he or she will act out as defense against remembering. He describes a case example of this defense in action, saying that a patient with an eventful life history and a long story of illness responded to questions of what occurs to his mind with silence and declared that, quote, nothing occurs to him. Freud interprets this silence as a resistance against remembering anything. Freud discusses the doctor's struggle to contain the patient's urge to repeatedly act out his symptoms. He explains that the patient's, quote, illness itself must no longer seem to him contemptible, but must become an enemy worthy of his mettle, a piece of his personality which has solid ground for its existence and out of which things of value for his future life have to be derived. Freud suggests that the fundamental rule of analysis is that the patient must work through his resistance and the urge to act out. That is, that analysis is the work of remembering. The theme of remembering or not remembering did manifest frequently in the women's interviews. One woman described how after being in therapy and spending time with a supportive female relative, she gradually realized the problems in the relationship. She said, quote, little by little, I started realizing, oh my God, this is really messed up, and I broke up with him. I didn't right away break up with him, but I told him there's some stuff going on in my family, so I need to focus on my family right now, and then we'll talk in like 3 months and see how it goes. A short time later, he returned and tried to convince her to let him back into her life. He was persistent and persuasive. Eventually, she spent time with him, which proved to be dangerous. On one occasion, he sexually assaulted her. Then, a while later, he raped her. That night, she described having a transformative moment. Quote, and that was the same night that I kind of like came to the light in a way. I asked God for help, and that was the night I stopped drinking. That was the last night. After that night, she moved to a different relative's home so he couldn't find her. She described how he continued to contact her, and she eventually agreed to meet up with him for coffee. And in recalling her conversation with him, she realized that she still couldn't see the relationship clearly. Quote, I told him I was sorry for leaving, for just cutting our relationship off, and I couldn't connect the dots. I didn't realize it really should have been me confronting him, but I didn't realize until way later, until after a lot of therapy and a lot of personal inventory in a way. Another woman reflected on how she had a hard time remembering events from this period in her life. She remembers anger. She said, I just feel like the more I know, the more I can help. And like there's so much anger. There was so much anger. I don't know if it's there now. It is dark. She joked about wanting to remember. Do you want to get it back? And laughed. As Freud cautioned, the tendency to forget and the compulsion to repeat are forceful dynamics of resistance. Dr. Christine Lewis explains that people in recovery from trauma may unconsciously keep something a secret, thereby staying in a state of incomplete knowing. She notes that unmentalizable material, quote, lives in implicit memory and again often presents in images, dreams, etc. She suggests that going into the terrifying dissociated room or knowing the abuse is both an intrapsychic and interpersonal process that is affected by internal figures that shame and blame and silence the woman, as well as by cultural and social factors that encourage silence. Although painful, this process of working through can be rewarding. Reconciliation can result in transformation, creativity, and growth towards individuation. I'd like to conclude by returning to my initial question of how the process of remembering may facilitate recovery. As practitioners, we have an opportunity to affect our patients, our colleagues, and the field of mental health. When we develop our own awareness and become more familiar with our resistance, we can be more attuned to how we respond to intimate partner violence with our patients and in our larger communities. We have to decide when to remain silent, when to knock, and when to open the door. Therapy presents us with the opportunity to work through what is often avoided. As Freud explained, one must allow the patient time to become more conversant with this resistance with which he has now become acquainted, to work through it, to overcome it by continuing in defiance of it, the analytic work according to the fundamental rule of analysis, end quote. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm grateful to the International Forum for Psychoanalytic Education for allowing me to be part of the panel and presenting this back in 2018. I'm also grateful to my friend Laura, who reminded me about my dissertation, which in turn reminded me, kind of a long wormhole here. It reminded me that I even did this presentation. And I do think it's kind of interesting that I had forgotten all about this work that I did. And I am really grateful for the women who participated in my dissertation research and the people who supported me throughout the dissertation process as well. And I do think it's really interesting that, we can do this type of work, right? This hard, challenging work, and then almost like forget about it for a time, and then life can call us back to it, and we can remember it all over again. And through a very different perspective, 2018 to 2026, I definitely do look at this a little differently today. The IFPE has a conference on the topic of subversion later this year. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I saw the advertisement for it. And my thought was, is remembering a form of subversion, right? And that kind of brought me back to this topic and wanting to look at it a little bit more. If you have any thoughts about this topic or questions for me, please put them in the comments because I'm curious to see where this work might take me next. Thank you for listening.